Hello, Dave Prouse here, and we're going to do an installation of Debian 10.4 into VirtualBox. I'm working on a Windows 10 computer here, and I've already downloaded and installed VirtualBox. And you can see I have that here, and I have a bunch of virtual machines. If we go to Help and go to About VirtualBox, you'll see that we're at VirtualBox version 6.1. You want to use VirtualBox 6.0 or higher to go ahead with this lab and to follow along with my step-by-step procedure. Close out of this. If you haven't downloaded VirtualBox already, you can get that from virtualbox.org/wiki/downloads. And the reason that I recommend this among other virtualization platforms is because, one, it's free, and two, it's available on a lot of different operating systems. You can install it on Windows, OS X, and Mac OS, various Linux distributions, and in fact, I run it on Debian and also Fedora, and it runs very well, and also Solaris. So you can grab that from here and install it. It's an easy installation. And then you'll have your VirtualBox manager when you open it up. Now, in order to install Debian, we have to create a virtual machine and install the operating system from the Debian ISO image. You can get Debian Linux at debian.org/distrib. And there's a lot of options here for people who have fast internet connections, slow internet connections, or no internet connection. But for the bulk of you, you'll select Download an Installation Image. And then from there, you'll select one of these options, depending on what platform you're running. Chances are, if you have, say, a PC with Windows, then you have an AMD 64 platform. So for the bulk of you, that's what you're going to select. But of course, you want to make sure you know what you're installing to for this lab. So check that first. But again, for the bulk of you, it's AMD 64. And if you click on that, it'll then download Debian 10.4 network install ISO image. It's about 350 megabytes. And it does some of the install off of the ISO image and some of the install off of the internet. I've already downloaded that, so we can go ahead and get going with the installation. So I'm back in VirtualBox, and the first thing we need to do is create a virtual machine. So we'll go to Machine and New. And this is the guided setup. You can also work in expert mode if you want, which is a little faster once you get used to VirtualBox. But we'll do guided mode for this lab and do it step by step. First thing we want to do is name this virtual machine. And you can see it's looking at Microsoft Windows by default, but we don't want that. The name of this is going to be Deb Server. So enter Deb Server there, and when you do so, it automatically recognizes, oh, Deb must be trying to install Linux Debian, most likely 64-bit. And indeed, that is what we're installing, a 64-bit version of Debian. That is the ISO image that we downloaded. And you want to be careful with that. You want to make sure that you're not selecting 32-bit because that won't work properly for the rest of the lab. And make sure you have the right distribution. It's got to be Debian 64-bit. And you want to select where you're saving this VirtualBox virtual machine to. I'm just using the default location. That's fine. And we'll click Next. Now it says select the amount of memory for the virtual machine. I'm pretty sure you can get away with just 512 megabytes for Debian, but they automatically put it as 1024, which should be fine for you. If you have more memory available, for example, on this laptop, I have 16 gig available, then consider doing a little bit more to increase performance and efficiency and set it up as 2 gig or 2048 megabytes. And we'll click Next. Again, if you don't have enough, if you only have, say, 4 gigabytes of RAM on your computer, then just stick to 1024, meaning 1 gigabyte of RAM. I'll click Next for that. Then it says, what do you want to do? You need to have some type of virtual hard drive, virtual disk to install the virtual machine to. And so we want to create a virtual hard disk now. We'll select create. And we're going to select the default option here for VDI. And next. And we're going to leave the default dynamically allocated. What that means is we're not going to use the total size. We're only going to use what we need on our real hard drive up to a maximum fixed size. And let's click next and see what that fixed size is. And you can see here it's 8 gig. You should have that 8 gig available. You could always lower it if you need to, but 8 gig is a good amount and it should be enough for this virtual machine for our purposes. And you can see it's creating a folder inside of VirtualBox VMs called debserver, and it's creating that virtual machine file, debserver.vdi. So that's it. We're going to click create. And that's going to make the virtual machine here. And we're pretty much ready to go. We just have to configure a couple things. The ISO image that we're going to be installing from, which you already should have downloaded from the Debian site, and also the networking type. So we'll right-click on the virtual machine and go to Settings. And in the Settings window, we'll make those changes. And you can make other changes if you needed to as well from here. I'm going to go down to Storage. And then we want to click on the disk where it says Empty. You can see it says No Disk Image File Selected. So we'll click on that. And then on the right, we'll select that image of the disk in the optical drive section, and we'll say choose a disk file. And you want to go to the folder where you have your ISO images. That could just be in downloads. I put it inside a folder called ISO. And you can see here I have a couple. I have Debian 10.3, Debian 10.4. As of the recording of this video, June 5th, 2020, that's the latest version of Debian. I also have Fedora Workstation. But this is the one we want, Debian 10.4, that you should have downloaded already from here. So we'll select that, click Open, and that'll now populate that disk area with that ISO image. So when we boot the system, it'll start installing from that. The other thing is the network. Let's click on Network now. By default, VirtualBox sets up a virtual network adapter. And by default, it does this as NAT, Network Address Translation. That means that your virtual machine will be on its own little internal network that can access the outside. Your host computer, your main computer, will be able to talk to that virtual machine, and the virtual machine will be able to access the internet. However, we want to have more than one virtual machine here. NAT only works for one virtual machine. If you're going to have more than one and you want those virtual machines to talk to each other, which we do for this lab and for the webinar, then you need to select NAT network. So that's important there. So for attached to, NAT's not going to work for multiple systems talking to each other. We have to select NAT network. If you don't have a NAT network, then we'd have to create one. And let me show that real quick. I'm going to click OK for this. If you don't have any NAT network listed, you would have to go to File, Preferences, then go to Network. And then you wouldn't see anything here, and you would have to click the plus sign here to add a new NAT network. And that's just creating a third one for me. If we double click on that, you'll see that it creates that NAT network name for you. By default, it'll just be called NAT network. Since I'm making another one, it calls it NAT network 1. And it gives you this IP scheme, 10.0.2.0/24. You don't have to use that. You could select something on, say, 192.168 or whatever, but this is the default that VirtualBox uses, 10.0.2.0. I'm going to leave that as the default. And actually, I don't want this one. If you have more NAT networks than you need, you can just get rid of those. This is the one that I'm using, which I've already created. Okay, so if you don't have one, create it. It's real simple, and then click OK. Then you need to go back to the virtual machine settings, go to Network, and select NAT Network, and select that NAT network that you just installed. Should be the only one there. And that should be good enough. We've got our storage set up with the disk, and we've got our NAT network set up so that our multiple virtual machines in VirtualBox will be able to communicate with each other. This stuff can also be done in the command line. In fact, you can do everything in the command line with VirtualBox, and I show some of that in the step-by-steps in the documentation underneath the video. Okay, one last thing. If you do ever have any issues trying to boot the system to the ISO image, just make sure that you have selected a disk file and make sure that you have selected an ISO image properly. Sometimes you might have some issues with this. It depends on the file type or the system you're on. So just double check that within the settings of the virtual machine within storage. But once you're done with that, you can go ahead and start the installation by double clicking on the virtual machine. So we'll do that now. And I'm running this off of a Windows 10 laptop. I'm actually connecting remotely. And here we go. This is our installation. I'd like you to get in the habit of doing a manual install with just text with the keyboard and no mouse. But you can select graphical install if you wish, where you're using the mouse. I'm going to leave it as install with just text. And it's done in a tab delimited format where you're using the tab key, the arrow keys, the enter key, and so on. So I'm going to arrow down to install and press enter. But either way, the installation will look pretty much the same. It's just the difference of whether you can use the mouse or not. So I'm going to do install and press enter. And that's going to start up the installation of Debian. And to make it a little bit more, well, this looks pretty viewable. I think we're pretty good here for now. Let's see if we can change the size. We can actually expand this and stretch out the screen. That might be a little better, actually, a little bigger, easier to see. So I just stretched out the screen so it filled out the entire monitor by pressing Control-C. So let's go ahead with the installation. First thing, select your language. You can do this in a different language if you wish, but I'm using English, and I will be using that throughout the course and my videos. So we're going to select English and press enter. I'm in the United States, so I'm pressing enter for that, but you're going to want to choose your country, wherever you're at. Press enter after you've selected. And then you want to configure your keyboard. I recommend using American English, but you might be using a different keyboard. For example, if you're in the UK, you want British English. But for my lab, I'm using American English, and we'll press enter. And that's going to start up the installation and load additional components. Okay, at this point, it's going to detect hardware, and it's going to try to connect to the network. IP version 6 will not work by default, but IP version 4 will, because the NAT network that we set up has a DHCP server, and it grabs an IP address automatically from that DHCP server. Later on, after the installation is finished, we're going to modify that and set a static IP. But for now, this is fine, so it allows us to get access to the internet. Because the NAT network is given internet access through your main network, through your LAN, via VirtualBox's system. Okay, next, please enter the host name for the system. For this lab, what we're doing is we're calling this Deb server, D-E-B-S-E-R-V-E-R, Deb server, and press enter. The domain name is going to be example.com. That's our test domain that we're going to use. So the fully qualified domain name will be debserver.example.com. So example.com for domain name, and press enter. Next, we need to configure a password for the root account. Now, some Linux distributions keep the root account locked by default. That's not the case with Debian here. So we want to select a complex password. So I'm going to select one now. Jot it down in your notes so you know what it is. We'll press enter, and we'll have to confirm that. And press enter. Next, we need to create a user account, a basic user account that does not have administrative privileges. And for this lab, I'm just calling it user. Press enter, and leave the username as user, and press enter, just keeping it really simple. And for this, we also want to choose a complex password. I'm selecting a different password and pressing enter and confirming it, and enter. Jot down that password as well. So you should have in your notes root and the password, and user and that password. Next is time zone. I'm in the Eastern, so I'm selecting that, but you're most likely going to select whatever your default is, unless you see that it's wrong there. So we'll press enter. That's going to load additional components. And we still have to configure our partitioning, and it's starting that up now. And you can do a guided setup, or you can do a manual setup. Now, if I'm installing a real server, a real physical server, and installing Debian to it, I would do it manually, and I'd go by the book and go through the numbers and make sure that I have separate partitions, like swap partition and EFI partition, and so on. But we don't need to do that for this lab. We can do a guided setup, use the entire disk, and just keep it simple. We'll press enter for that. What is the disk? Well, it's whatever you see on the next screen. That is the virtual drive. And for this, it calls it VBox hard disk. Different virtualization platforms will use different names, but essentially it's a virtual drive, and it should be the only one there. So we're going to select that and press enter. Next, the partitioning scheme. Do you want to separate the home partition? Well, generally in the field, I would do that, but we don't need to have a separate partition for the home directory. We're going to put all the files in one partition and just press enter. That is the default setting. That configures the new partitions, and it gives you a review of what we have there. We have one partition, which is 6.4 gig, and that is ext4. That's the file system that's being used. That's where all the files are going to go. And then we have our swap partition, which deals with hard drive and memory, which is 2.1 gig. That is perfect. That'll work very well for us. So we're going to leave that as is and click, we're going to press enter for finish partitioning and write changes to disk. And then you have to confirm that. So we'll arrow over to yes and write those changes to the disk. All right, and that's going to go ahead and install the base system. So I'm going to pause the video here and let that go, and I'll be back when it is done. Okay, and at this point you can see that my installation is done with the disk, quote unquote. Do we want to scan another disk? No, we do not. And you can feel free to pause the video at any time to catch up if you're still doing the installation, but I'm going to press enter for no. And then we have to do a little bit more here. We're going to have to configure the package manager and then get additional information from the internet and set up grub, and then our installation will be done. So the goal is to find a mirror of the Debian archive, and you're going to want to select your country. I'm selecting United States and pressing enter. And then you want to select a mirror which is close to you, but usually for most of you, deb.debian.org will work. Whatever the default is that's there will probably work fine for you. If in doubt though, deb.debian.org. So I'm going to press enter for that. Now it says if you're using an HTTP proxy, then you have to enter the information in there as shown. So that may take you a moment to get in there. But for the vast majority of you, you're going to be using an HTTP proxy. So I'm going to leave mine blank. I don't have one, and pressing enter. That's going to configure APT, which is the package manager for Debian. Whenever you install or uninstall programs within Debian, you use the apt command. Previously, it was apt-get. So you'll hear me say things like, okay, let's do an apt install and whatever program. That's the package manager for that. Okay, once apt has been installed, we're going to get to the select and install software portion. And this part's very important. We need to make sure that we are not selecting a graphic interface. We don't want to use a desktop environment here. And that's because if you work with servers, the desktop environment really just takes up space, slows it down. There's a drop in performance. So we don't want to have a desktop environment. We want to just have a console, just command line only. Now the message here is talking about the PopCon, the popularity contest. For any test virtual machines, you don't really want to be a part of this. If it's a real system, you may want to choose to participate, but we're going to say no for this. And now we're at the task selection screen. What software are we going to select here? Well, the main thing that we have to deselect is that Debian desktop environment. So we're going to highlight that and then press the space bar to remove it. Very important. We don't want any desktop environment. We want command line only. So no Debian desktop environment, no GNOME, no XFCE, no KDE, Cinnamon, any of that. So make sure that that is deselected. Very important. Otherwise, it's going to make things very different for you if you're running through the lab step by step with me in the future. So deselect that. We're also going to deselect print server, but we want to select SSH server. So you should have an asterisk next to SSH server and an asterisk next to standard system utilities, and that's it. Press the tab key to get to continue and just verify that none of the desktop options are selected. The only two that should be selected here are SSH and standard system utilities. And we'll press enter to continue. That's going to go ahead through the bulk of the installation and grab a lot of information from the internet as well. So I'm going to pause my recording here while that retrieves all those files and installs those, and be back in a little bit. Okay, it got to 100%, and then it started the grub bootloader portion. We do want to have the grub bootloader loaded to the master boot record, so we're going to leave it as yes and press enter. And then it's going to ask you, what device are we installing the bootloader to? If you don't do this, most likely the boot up will fail, by the way. So we're going to select the only device that is there. It's /dev/SDA. And that's our virtual hard drive, our virtual drive, I should say. So select that and press enter. That's going to go ahead and install the grub bootloader. And then finish up the installation. So again, this was an installation of Debian 10.4. We did it with no desktop environment, and that effectively is what we do for a server. If you wanted a client, you'd select the desktop environment and use something like GNOME. That's the default. But now it says installation complete. Congratulations, you've completed your installation of Debian, and you did this in a text format with keyboard only. And we're going to continue to work with the keyboard only. as we go forward. So we're going to press enter for continue. That's going to finish it up. And reboot. And there's your grub boot screen. And there's Debian. And that's going to load up now. And there we go. We're at the Deb server login. Name of the computer is Deb server. And we can log in now. So you could log in as the user account if you wish to. I'm just going to log in as root because we're going to be making administrative changes to this system. So we'll type root and press enter. And then the password, whatever that password is that you chose for the root account that you wrote down in your notes. And enter. And that should bring you into root at Deb server. We're in. So what we want to do here is we want to run an IP space A command to find out the IP address that VirtualBox gave this system through DHCP. So we'll press enter for IPA. And if you look down at number 2, I have a network adapter called ENP0S3. And we want to make note of that. And I'm jotting that down now because that's a variable. It'll change depending on what virtualization platform you're using or what day of the month it is. ENP0S3 for me. And if you look a couple lines below that, you'll see the internet address, the IP address. It says inet, and I'm on 10.0.2.16/24. I'm going to jot that down as well, 10.0.2.16/24, because later I'm going to SSH into this system using that IP address most likely. Finally, I want to ping something on the internet. For example, example.com. Just to see that we do have internet access. We should, because we've been grabbing a lot of files from the internet. So we should have that. And we're good. It's pinging example.com at 93.184.216.34. Okay, so we're going to do a bit more configuration with this system, but it is installed. And so I'll be back in just a moment. Okay, I'm back, and these installation videos can be a little bit lengthy. At this point, I want to do some configuration so you're all ready to go and work with Debian and work with it in a manner that's suitable to the webinar that we're going to be doing. And so there's a couple things we want to do here. First, we want to install some software, and we're going to do that with the apt command, and that's apt install. And there's a couple things I want. First, I want Vim, which is my favorite editor. You're welcome to use Nano, which is built in. If you want to, that's fine. But I'm going to install Vim, also curl, and Git. And put spaces in there for each. So that's apt install Vim curl Git. We'll press enter. You could do a -y with that. If it gets in the way for some reason, you could try it without. But I'm going to say Y for this, yes. And install those packages. Okay, so those are installed. And now I can use the Vim command to edit configuration files. And the first one I want to edit is the grub configuration file. So I can change my resolution here a little bit, just show you how this works. I'm going to do a vim/etc/default. And this isn't necessary. You don't have to do this. It's optional. But just wanted to show this real quick. And also so you could see a little bit better in the video for the rest of the way. So that's a vim/etc. Oh, I got 2 slashes there. /default/grub. Press enter for that, and you'll see some information here. I'm going to press I to insert and arrow down to grub command line Linux default. I'm going to change this from quiet to no mode set. That's in quotes. No mode set. And then I'm going to add a line called grub underscore gfx payload underscore Linux equals, and I'm going to select my resolution. And I'm just going to do 1280 by 720 because that's actually what I'm recording at here right now. So that's a grub underscore gfx underscore payload underscore Linux equals, and the res is 1280 by 720. I'm going to escape out and save it with a :WQ and press enter. And then we have to update the grub. So we'll do an update dash grub. That's how you do it on Debian. Nice. And we're going to reboot the server and see our changes and see if it looks a little nicer for us. So this is just an extra little trick. If you're working in the console, make it look a little bit better. And you can choose what resolution you want as long as grub supports it. And you can already see that the font is way better, much more visible. Okay. Log back in. And we can go further with this. We can modify the font further with dpkg, the dpackage-reconfigure, and console setup. And I like to select terminus bold, but whatever works best for you, and increase the size a little bit. That usually works well on a server if I have to work locally at it just in the beginning. Press OK. All right. That's not actually going to do any changes in VirtualBox, but in other virtualization platforms it would. It would change the font. But just changing the resolution has made it a bit more visible. So that's a little bit of grub stuff for you. We've done our installation of Vim and curl and git. Now you also want to make sure that the system is updated. If you just downloaded the latest version of Debian, it should be. But to check, we could do an apt update, press enter, and that's going to look through the list of accepted sources from the sources.list file to see if there are any updates available to the system or to applications. Okay, and it says all packages are up to date, so that's good. However, if it did find packages that needed to be updated, say 3 months down the line, then we would go ahead and do an apt upgrade. Oops, an apt upgrade to actually upgrade those packages. We don't need to do that here, so we'll move on to the next step. Next is the host name. Well, we already set the host name when we did the installation, and if we type host name, we'll see that our name is Deb server. But if for some reason something went wrong or you wanted to make changes, we could modify the host name, and we would do that with a vim/etc/hostname. Press enter for that. And you'll see I'm set up as Deb server. What I really want to be set up as for the lab is debserver.example.com. I want that fully qualified domain name in there. And even though we put the domain in that we want to use during the installation, that's not showing up yet in the host name. So I want that fully qualified domain name right now, debserver.example.com. I'm going to save that. And then we want to modify, I'm just clearing the screen with a Control-L, but we want to modify the IP address. Now, we jotted down what our IP address is. For me, it's 10.0.2.16/24. For you, it's going to be different. And I want to modify this because right now we're getting this IP automatically from VirtualBox. I want to set this up as a static IP address, manually configured. That's how most of the servers I set up are going to work. Unless you have a big server farm with lots and lots of servers that get their IPs dynamically, you want to have a static IP address. So most of the time you want to have a static IP. So let's modify that. Now in Debian, with no desktop environment, you do this with the networking service. So we're going to do vim/etc/network/interfaces. That's the configuration file that we want to modify. We'll press enter for that, and we'll see down here that it is set up as DHCP. I don't want that. I want static. So I'm going to press I to insert and remove DHCP. We'll add static. Press enter, tab once, and then add the address. What is the IP address? It's whatever you jotted down. So address, and for me, it's 10.0.2.16/24. Important to have that net mask. Press enter, tab once, and we also need to know the gateway address, which if you're on VirtualBox, by default, if you're using this network number, it should be 10.0.2.1. That's it. So make sure you enter static and then enter your address, whatever it is that you jotted down, with the /24, and then gateway and 10.0.2.1. I'm going to save this, escape, and :WQ to save. Okay, and the next thing is we need to set up the DNS server. That's done in a separate location. We're more in old school. We're in the networking service. We're not using Network Manager. We're not using Systemd, Networkd. We're using the original Linux networking service. That's what we do on these types of servers. It works very well most of the time. So let's modify DNS, and we'll do that with a vim/etc/resolve.conf, and that's resolv.conf. No E in there. And we'll press enter for that. And you'll see I have two name servers here. This is two different networks that this system could be on. I don't want those. I want 10.0.2.1. So press I to insert. I'm going to get rid of the bottom one and modify the first one, the first name server, to 10.0.2.1. That's it. So the name server, that's our DNS server. That's what's going to do our resolution from domain name to IP address, host name to IP address. And I want that to be the main IP that goes out through VirtualBox, the same as the gateway. Escape out of there, and we'll save this. I'll do a Shift+Z, and it is written. Okay, so now we want to reboot and make sure our changes have taken effect. So we'll type reboot and press enter. You'll notice that the Linux kernel being used is 4.19 for Debian 10.4. And, they're already up to kernel 6. If you run a Fedora system, you'll be on 5.6 right now. So you may say that Debian's behind, but that's one of the things that makes it rock solid. Okay. Mine's locking up a little bit, but I'm going to log in as root again. Okay. Cleared screen. Let's take a look. Hostname, debserver.example.com. Good. IP space A, the IP address is there. You can check the gateway by doing an IP route show, and it'll show you the default via 10.0.2.1. That's what we want. And finally, we got to test it. We got to ping something on the internet. So I'll do a ping example.com and see what we get. Little slow on my system. The laptop is a little bit slow, but we are getting resolution and replies. One more thing, we'll check that DNS one more time just to make sure that it took. If you were using DHCP, this would go back to whatever other IPs were there, but we set it to static. And by the way, that's fine, but we set it to static, and so it should show that. It does, and we are getting replies. Here's one of my domain names. Just checking multiple domains out there, and we should be good. That's the IP. And this is a common trend now. The IP address is also included in the name of the server where that domain is. You'll see that a lot with web hosts today. Okay, Control C to break out, and we are good to go here. At this point, I want to do a couple more things. I want to connect via SSH because it's going to be a lot easier to copy and paste stuff through your command line as opposed to typing it all within this console. So we want to set up SSH. Unfortunately, with VirtualBox, it's not the easiest thing to do. You have to create some type of route or do some type of port forwarding. I'm going to show you the port forwarding method now. Let's just get right into it. Okay, go back into VirtualBox here. And what we want to do is we want to go back to our NAT network that we created. And that's done by going to File, Preferences, then go to Network, and then select that NAT network that you created. It should be the only one there. Double click it to bring up the NAT network details. Note that it says here it supports DHCP. That's what gave Debian the IP address automatically before we set it to static. Later on in the webinar that I run, we turn off DHCP so that there's no conflicts. But what I want to configure here is port forwarding. So we'll click on that now, and you'll see you have some port forwarding rules. Well, we don't have any rules yet, but that's the screen. And that's what I want to create. I want to create a rule here. So I'm going to click the plus sign here to create a new port forwarding rule, and I'll just call it SSH. We want it to be using TCP, not UDP. And then here's what we do. We use the local host IP to connect through. So it's a little trick to get through to the 10 network within VirtualBox. Now, if you're using VMware Workstation or KVM or whatever else, you won't have this problem. You'll be able to SSH directly to the virtual machine, even if it's on a NAT network. But with VirtualBox, you have to go through some hoops here. So the local host IP is 127.0.0.1, no matter what system you're working at. So that's what we're going to use. And then we're going to select a host port. I'm going to select 2222, which is a dynamically assigned port. It's something that you don't really have to worry about being used. That's going to be what we're going to connect from our command prompt later, from our main system. Then we need to know the guest IP. Well, that's the IP address of the virtual machine that we just set up. And you jotted down that IP. For me, it was 10.0.2.16. And the guest port, we want to put in 22. That's the port for SSH. So the guest IP, that's the virtual machine. That's the guest. That's Deb server. It, for me, is 10.0.2.16. Whatever your IP address is, you're going to plug that in there. And for the guest port, port 22 inbound will be open, allowing SSH connections so we can communicate from our command prompt or command line from Windows. In this case, Windows. Doesn't matter what operating system it is. But again, the host IP, instead of saying what the IP address is of our host, we're using the local host IP, which is the same for any system out there. So you use that 127.0.0.1 and then host port 2222. I may get an error with that, but it should work for you if you've never done this before. For each additional virtual machine that you want to connect to, you'll add another rule. And so, for example, I might set up, well, we are definitely going to clone this and have a Deb client. And then you could plug that in. You need a new rule for each virtual machine you want to connect to within VirtualBox. And you'd need to create a new port number. So I would just increase the number by 1. So for the second virtual machine, it would be 2223. For the third virtual machine, 2224. But the guest port the inbound SSH port will remain the same, 22 down the line. And the guest IP is whatever the IP address is of that client. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that one. We don't need that, but I'm going to save this, and we should hopefully be able to connect. Click OK for that, and then click OK for the details, and click OK for VirtualBox. A couple things here. We're going to want to shut down the virtual machine. So shut down now. And we're going to want to close VirtualBox so that we can get all those changes saved. Make sure they take effect. Reopen VirtualBox. Bring up the virtual machine again. Boot him up. All right, that's booting up. A little bit slow on the laptop that I'm connecting to, but I'm trying to show VirtualBox. So there's our login. We're going to leave that, and now we'll connect from the command prompt. So I'm on Windows, so I'm going to use the command prompt. You could also use PowerShell. If you're on another system, just open a terminal. So I'll open the command prompt here. Ooh, nice white with blue. Actually, no. Let's use PowerShell and stick with the black. So I'm going to do an SSH command, and I'm going to connect to a user account on the Debian server. It's going to be user at, but it's going to be 127.0.0.1 because we're using that local host to pass through. Then we need to do a -p and the port that we're connecting on, 2222. And we'll press enter. Okay, and it does say for me that there is already a host that's using that port. So you shouldn't get this if it's the first time you've done it, but it's on line 8 of that file known hosts. I could fix that. I could just use a different port if I wanted to. But I'll go to the .sh folder, and inside there you'll see the known hosts. And we could actually modify that file or just remove that file altogether if we wanted to. It's gone. Okay, and we'll try connecting again. And there you go. It's just going to create a new known hosts file because I don't have anything on there, so it's no big deal. And we'll say yes. And that's what you want. That's what you should see the first time you connect with your command, SSH user at 127.0.0.1-p2222. So I'm going to say yes. And then we need to know the password of the user account on our virtual machine. So that's whatever you selected for user that you jotted down. We'll type that in. And we're in. We're into user at deb server. And now I can take a look at that actual system. And we can do everything that we need to do here that we would normally do on the server within the console. We're just doing it from our main system and SSHing in. And the beauty of this now is that anything that we find on the internet, if we find information that we need to cut and paste, we can now do that easily by pasting it in directly to the same system. So we can browse the web, we can grab information, and we can paste all that info in here. So that's the beauty of SSHing in. And so whatever works best for you, using the command prompt or the PowerShell. Okay, so awesome stuff. A couple other things we want to do here. When you're working with the server, we're going to be doing everything as root. Now, of course, in the field, we wouldn't use the root account, but that's what we're going to be doing for these videos and for the webinar and so on. So to connect as root, when we're SSH'd in, I don't like to SSH in directly as root. That's not a good security practice. So I've SSH'd in as user at deb server, but then we could always extend our privileges to root by doing a su dash, that's su space dash, press enter, and type the password of the root account. And now we're in as root, and we can do whatever we want, including shutting down the system. So we can do a shutdown now, and press enter, and that'll shut it down. That'll automatically close the SSH connection. And we'll go back to VirtualBox, and I want to make a clone of this virtual machine. And that's going to be the Debian client that we'll be using in the webinar. So we'll right click on that and select clone. All right. Now, in a lot of cases, you'd want to generate new MAC addresses. We don't have to do that. We can leave the default settings here. We're just going to change the name to Deb Clients and press next and make sure it says full clone and clone it. Now in the field, out in the real world, I don't rely on clones. That's just for testing and for speed. But for what we're doing, it's fine, should be okay. And you could always clone it again if this clone fails. So now we have our Deb client, and we can go ahead and modify that one as well. But we can leave that as is for now. In the webinar, we'll make the changes that we have to make to the Deb client. As long as you have those two, you're good to go. And the beauty of cloning is all the configurations and everything that we did on Deb server are applied to Deb client. So you don't have to go through the installation again. We just make that clone, and that's it. Let me just check and make sure that that's everything we did. We set up the virtual machine in VirtualBox. We showed where to get the VirtualBox software if you don't have it, and also how to get the Debian ISO image. We showed how to create the virtual machine, and don't forget about setting up the storage and setting up that ISO image. It's not going to show anymore. It actually disables that within VirtualBox automatically because the installation is finished, but you need to make sure you have that ISO image there before you start the install. We set up the NAT network, and we actually showed how to create a NAT network, which was done in File, Preferences, Network. You can make those here. We did the installation, went through that step by step. We showed how to do an update of the OS. We installed some programs, Vim, curl, and Git. We changed the host name. We changed to a static IP. We modified the DNS server IP address with resolve.conf. And then we showed how to set up SSH, which was also done here in the NAT network section, port forwarding, and by creating a custom rule, and then showed how to SSH in from the command prompt or PowerShell. And again, there's other ways to do this. This is just one method that I like. We SSH'd in, we shut down, and then we made a clone for Deb client. So now for the Debian server and client, you should be ready to go for the webinar. The only other thing you would need is the Fedora server and optionally a Fedora client. And that's going to be in a different video. So that's it for this video. We have installed Deb server 10.4. Congratulations. And I'll see you at the next video.